welcome to History Roundtable. I am your host, Ian Nolan Withington. First, I guess I should explain the episode, how this show works, seeing as this is the first episode. This is a history show where I talk about history with historians and history buffs. So, if you need any more information than that, stay after the show. I got some more information for you. But in the meantime, let's get right into it. I'll let my guest introduce himself.
My name is James Meyer. I'm an associate professor of Islamic world history at Montana State University.
All right, then I'll let you have the floor to set the stage.
Okay, so we're talking about my book, Turks Across Empires, Marketing Muslim Identity in the Russian Ottoman Borderlands. And this is a book that focuses on both of the areas of specialization that I do. So I work on the late Imperial Ottoman Empire. I also work on the late Imperial Russian Empire. And the book that I published a little over a year ago focuses on this period of time beginning with the end of the Crimean War in 1856, and the book ends with the beginning of World War I, 1914, and it looks at a time in which there was a great deal of mobility taking place between the Russian and Ottoman empires. Many people know already about the large number of Muslims who left Russia to arrive for one reason or another in the Ottoman Empire, but not a lot of people have looked at the folks who go back. And so one of the three main developments from the time period that I look at that is explored in my book is this mobility, particularly among Muslims traveling back and forth between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. A second major theme that my book looks at is the impact of a series of revolutions that took place in the first decade of the 20th century. So that would be the Russian Revolution of 1905, the Iranian Revolution of 1905, and also the Ottoman Revolution of 1908. And thirdly, my book also looks at what I describe as the politicization of civilizational identity, by which I'm referring specifically to national and religious identity forms. And so what the book does is it traces the lives of three individuals in particular. One is named Yusuf Akçura, another one is named Ismail Gasprinsky, the third one is named Ahmet Ağaoğlu. And while these three individuals are known mainly for their contributions to intellectual history, the three people who are at the center of my book have traditionally been known by historians as proto-Turkish nationalists of a sort. So Turkish nationalists who existed before the creation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. But what I do is I look at these three individuals and I situate them within the larger context of what's going on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right, so let's actually start talking about those three right now. They seem to have a great role in what we're about to talk about, and that's why you decided to focus on them, I assume.
Yeah. Well, they're well-known figures in among scholars. There have been lots of books written by all three of these individuals, but nothing really all that original for quite some time in an older generation of scholarship. So we're talking about books published in the 50s and the 60s, the 70s, even the early 1980s. back then, it was kind of assumed that if somebody was writing an intellectual history of figures, and the three individuals at the center of my book are tend to be discussed in terms of intellectual history. So they're discussed in terms of the ideas and arguments that we find in their writings about nationalism. And that's how they had always been portrayed in older studies. In more recent decades, relatively little has been looked at with respect to these three individuals who are known collectively as pan-Turkists. Let me just explain quickly what the term pan-Turkists is supposed to mean.
Go ahead.
So, as we use as folks who wanted to somehow create a broader sense of community identity extending between Turkic Muslims in the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East more generally, and connect them to Muslim Turks in the Russian Empire, of which there are many Turkic people. I mean, even today, about 14% of Russia is Muslim. Not all of them are Turkic Muslims. People like Chechens, for example, are not Turkic, but say Tatars, Bashkirs, also Crimean Tatars. These are different Turkic Muslim groups that live in Russia and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union today. So the three individuals that I look at who, like I said, are generally seen as being pan-Turkist, indeed implying that they either had a political or perhaps a more cultural understanding of identity that transcended the Ottoman-Russian border. And as I mentioned, several works had already been written on these figures. Those works tend to focus mainly on their published writings. So historians who were working on these figures would read the newspapers and the journals in which these individuals published, and then they would write about the ideas about nationalism or identity or other hot topics of the day, according to Atra, Kasprinsky, and Aolu. In more recent years, not a lot of people have worked on these figures, mainly because I think people got the sense that there was relatively little in common between these elite intellectuals writing in newspapers and journals that relatively few people read. And I think people just started thinking, well, what if anything, does the story of a handful of intellectuals tell us about what is going on more generally in Russia and the Ottoman Empire? And whereas I think, a few decades ago, maybe in the 1970s and the 1980s, historians took it for granted that writing about ideas was itself important. Was something that didn't need to be further justified as being relevant. Well, we're writing about ideas and arguments of really smart people. Isn't that important enough as it is? That was, I think, pretty much the assumption back then, whereas in more recent decades, when there's been a cultural turn in history, a social turn in history, historians are looking more at social causes, cultural causes, getting away from just reporting on the ideas of a handful of intellectuals. That assumption that someone would be important just because they published 110 years ago is no longer really there. And so it became increasingly frequent in broader studies of Russia and the Ottoman Empire to kind of dismiss the pan-Turkists. How important are these figures, after all? What do they have in common with the vast majority of other Muslims living in Russia or other people living in the Ottoman Empire? So what I did with this book was take a handful of individuals who are known mainly for their ideas and arguments and the debates that they undertook in a print medium. And I look at them a little bit more generally in terms of how they fit into their times. And so, whereas I look also at their ideas and arguments, I'm also really this is a book that is more about the era than just three people, and shows how these three people represented much larger developments that were taking place in their era. And those developments are the ones that I was discussing a few minutes ago, mainly in terms of mobility, as was the case with millions of other Muslims. These three people who are at the center of my story, Oktro, Kaspersky, and Aolu, they were all Muslim activists from Russia who led fascinating lives. Kaspersky was born in the center of Russia, in the Russian heartland, a place I call Central Russia. It's also known as the Volga-Ural region in a lot of the scholarship. And when when Oktro was a small child, his father died, after which Oktro and his mother moved to Istanbul. Oktro was about 9 years old at the time. Oktro and his mother then lived in Istanbul. Oktro attended a military academy, attended military university in Istanbul, where he was arrested for taking part in what was considered a subversive student discussion group. Oktro was then sent to Ottoman Libya as a punishment, as a kind of quasi-exile. He escaped from that, went to Paris, studied at the Sorbonne. After studying law and getting his degree, he then returned to Russia just before the 1905 revolution. He later had to flee Russia, move back to the Ottoman Empire after the 1908 revolution in Istanbul, and then, indeed, even after World War I, spent some of his time, about a year and a half, in Russia, before eventually settling in Istanbul and in the Turkish Republic. And Kaspersky and Aolu, Kaspersky was from the Crimea, Aolu was from what is today Azerbaijan. They had similarly spent their lives traveling back and forth between the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Paris. Both Kaspersky and Aolu also studied in Paris. And then ultimately, in the case of Aolu, the Turkish Republic as well, whereas Kaspersky died in 1914. However, kind of what's different about what I was doing in this book is, whereas these three individuals are known mainly for their writing and their ideas and their arguments, I tried to place them within the context of what was going on more generally among Muslims in Russia in the Ottoman Empire in the final decades of the imperial era. So first of all, I placed these individuals within the context of mobility. Like I was saying in response to your first question, there were large numbers of Muslims moving back and forth between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And typically historians have understood this in terms of Muslims fleeing Russia for the Ottoman Empire, which in many cases was true. However, a lot of these Muslims would eventually return to Russia. So there was a fair bit of what we call return immigration as well. And then there were a lot of Muslims who managed, through ways that I explain in my book, to hold dual subjecthood, de facto dual subjecthood between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and take advantage of that. And I argue that these three individuals that I focus on in my book, who are known as sort of the architects of the future national Turkish nation, who have traditionally been seen by scholars as individuals who somehow managed to see into the future and articulate a future Turkish national homeland. My argument is that these individuals, actually, what made them special was the peculiar set of circumstances relating to the late imperial era. And so, indeed, once the nation state was actually developed, and I know we'll get into that a little bit later, these individuals actually kind of lost their place. Kind of what made them special was this concatenation of developments taking place in the late 19th and early 20th century, involving, as I said, mobility, a wave of revolutions in which these individuals took part, and also, as I mentioned before, the politicization of civilizational identity, in which these figures were at the very heart, in fact, in their writings about national identity, about religious identity, about what it means to be a Turk, what it means to be a Russian Muslim, the various types of identity, the multiple types of identity that they all adopted during various points in their lifetime. And so that's actually kind of another difference between my book and traditional historiography on these folks, is that they've normally been seen through the prism of an emerging Turkish nationalism, a Turkish nationalism that we all know is going to come into fruition in the 1920s with the creation of the Republic of Turkey. However, when we actually look at what these people were writing, sorts of projects that they were involved with, both in Russia and in the Ottoman Empire in the final decades of empire, they were interested in a lot more than just Turkish nationalism. Turkish nationalism was one of many options that were on the table for them. And it just so happened that the way things worked, an independent Turkey was created, and that's where they found their final home.
All right. I want to actually talk about the revolution and the post-revolution period in Russia and Ottoman empires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one thing that's kind of interesting about this period is that there was a wave of revolutions transpiring, and this took place, first of all, in Russia in 1905, with, it's called a revolution, even though Tsar Nicholas II was able to stay on the throne. However, he did so only by creating certain reforms, one of which was to create a new elected parliament, and another one was a promise to create a constitution. Well, this revolution in 1905 in Russia also created a lot of opportunities for people, especially Visbrinsky in the Crimea, Aolu in the southern Caucasus, and Aktra in central Russia. These are the three locations in Russia where the largest concentration of Muslims Muslims was to be found, at least within Russia itself, not including Central Asia. But the Muslims of Central Asia really had very little to do with what was going on with respect to revolutionary politics in Russia in 1905. But Muslims who were living closer to the imperial center, like in places like Kazan, which is where Akhtra was living at the time, or the Crimea, or again the Southern Caucasus, what is today Azerbaijan. Muslims in those places were to varying degrees more organized and developed and involved, because I think the closer people were living to the imperial center, the more that they felt that they had a stake in what was to happen in this new revolutionary system that was created in 1905. And so all three of them were community organizers. All three of them had been involved in community activities before the revolution as well. But the revolution of 1905 really gave them some opportunities to be community leaders in a legal, public way that otherwise would never have transpired for these individuals. For example, Yusuf Akhtra, he became one of the most important figures in the Ittifaq party, Ittifak, and that was a Muslim political movement that was created by Akhtra and Ismail Gasprinsky and other Muslims living mostly in central Russia. Gasprinsky was from the Crimea. He was a bit of an exception in that regard. Most of the Muslims who were at the very center of Ittifaq were from either Kazan or Ufa, or two cities that are part of Russia today, the respective republics of Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, which are in what people call the Volga-Ural region, but which I call Central Russia. Ultimately, the Ittifaq party did not play a huge role in Russian history. The first Russian parliament that was elected was dissolved after a few months by the Tsar. The second Russian parliament that was elected, that too was dissolved. Then, before the third parliament, the electoral law was changed, and it made it much more difficult for peasants to elect representatives, and it became kind of a rubber stamp parliament after that. So I don't want to exaggerate the importance of electoral politics in late imperial Russia. However, what I do look at in this section of my book is that at the time, in late 1905, after the October Manifesto, in which the Tsar announced these reforms, creating a parliament, a desire to create a constitution, which was never created. At the time, however, within Muslim communities, especially those Muslims who were engaged and who cared about relations between Muslim communities and the Russian state, at the time, it looked like there could be a real possibility for electoral politics to matter in the future, and for a Muslim political party. There was only one Muslim political party, one large Muslim political party, that was the Ittifaq party. And then that party gained representation in parliament. It had a couple of dozen representatives to the first parliament, and about, I think it was 35 representatives was the high water point in the second parliament. This is a parliament that had over 500 representatives altogether. But nevertheless, at the time, it seemed that if Russia was truly, if the parliament was truly going to play an important role in Russian politics, and if there was just one Muslim party in parliament, then that party could perhaps gain an important role in helping to determine legislation relating to Muslims in particular. So it didn't matter so much that it was a relatively small number of Muslims in Parliament compared to the size of Parliament more generally. What mattered was that the only Muslims in Parliament were ones who were associated with the Ittifaq party in one way or another. And so people like Kaspersky and Akhtar and Aulu and other Muslim activists in late imperial Russia thought that this would be their chance to finally have an influence in determining Russian Muslim education, for example. That was a very important issue, and I devote one chapter of my book to that. Or, other issues that were of concern to Muslims in Russia. I devote one chapter to all the concerns taking place in central Russia, where again, Muslims living in that region, in what is, Kazan, Ufa, part of Russia today too, in those regions, Muslims have been living under Russian rule since the mid-16th century. Muslims had much more day-to-day contact with Tsarist administration than was the case with Muslims living in Central Asia, for example, or further out on the periphery. So Muslims living in the more of the heartland areas of Russia, they tended to have stronger opinions about what they wanted Tsarist administration of Muslims to look like, and they tended to have stronger opinions about the role of state institutions that were responsible for managing Muslim communities in Russia, whereas Muslims living further out on the periphery tended to have, less sharply formed opinions and ideas and concerns about the role of Russian state institutions, because those institutions were less developed and had been out there, and there were fewer of them. But in central Russia, this is a big issue. So politics for Muslims after 1905, at least initially, at least for as long as it looked like things might change, was actually something that attracted a lot of interest, most of all in central Russia. I would say probably secondly in the Crimea, which, not coincidentally, the Crimea was the region of Russia that has the second longest history of connection between Muslims and Russia, and then also in the Southern Caucasus, which, if we look at the main regions of the former Russian Empire and where there were Muslims, those are the three regions, Central Russia, the Crimea, and the Southern Caucasus, that have respectively the longest histories going back to contact with Russian state, Russian rule, and Russian institutions. And so these were the three regions where Muslims actually cared the most about, what changes the revolution might bring. However, as I mentioned before, the revolution ended up being rather short-lived. And by 1907, there was what people called a counter-revolution that took place in Russia with this new electoral law that was passed. A lot of people were disenfranchised, a much more pliant parliament was elected in Russia, and following that there was a wave of arrests of activists, not only Muslim activists, but political activists more generally. I mean, it was mostly Russian leftists that bore the brunt of this at the very beginning, but then Muslims and others who had been involved in politics between 1905 and 1907 were also harassed, sent to internal exile in Siberia, more restrictions were placed by the authorities on their activities. And so those who had an option left. And for Turkic-speaking Muslims, the Ottoman Empire had always been an option. It was a place where you could go. It was relatively easy for a Muslim moving to the Ottoman Empire to become an Ottoman subject. And the Ottoman Empire was in some ways analogous to the way Israel is today. If you're Jewish and you're growing up in Uzbekistan today, and you have that option if you wish to pursue it of moving to Israel and becoming an Israeli citizen. Similarly, in the Ottoman Empire was seeking to gain citizens, subjects in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so, it was relatively easy for a Muslim to move from Russia, or somewhere else for that matter, but in this case we're looking at Russia, to move from Russia. And the Ottomans would, since 1860, the Ottoman Empire had a state organization that was responsible for settling Muslims, usually settling Muslims in parts of the Ottoman Empire where state authorities had determined it was necessary to increase the population in order to increase development, industrial development, economic development, or agricultural development. And so, that option was always there. And this is one of the ways in which I see these relatively remote, elite, intellectual figures like Akhtar, Gasprinski, and Aoulou actually have a lot in common with millions of other Muslims, of which we know very little. Nameless, faceless people emigrating or moving back and forth between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, looking to better their lives, and in the case of the Pan-Turkists, better their careers as well. So that's the context in which I place the departure between 1908 and 1910 of Muslim activists from Russia to Istanbul. In 1908, the Young Turks took power in Istanbul. They overthrew Sultan Abdulhamid II, who'd been on the throne since 1876. And the Young Turk regime in Istanbul changed things for the activists, and suddenly Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire became a much more hospitable location for constitutionalist parliamentarian activists from Russia. They knew that they could move to Istanbul and they could be guests of the Young Turk regime. Now, and that was certainly preferable to being arrested or sent to Siberia in Russia, which at that time was happening to a lot of the people, Muslim and otherwise, who had been involved in politics between 1905 and 1907 in Russia. So the people that I look at, Gasprinski died in 1914, and he never moved permanently to Istanbul, although in his youth he had tried a couple of times. But from that point forward, in chapter 6 of the book, which looks at the lives of the Pan-Turkists in Istanbul, I look at Akhtar and Aoulou, and then I look at a third fellow named Husseinzadeh Ali. He becomes more or less the third person that I look at after Gasprinski dies. And I look at Husseinzadeh Ali also because he's another one of these activists, intellectuals. He was from the Southern Caucasus, who felt that he had to flee Russia after 1907, after the counter coup, and then 1908 there's a revolutionary Russia in the Ottoman Empire, that is, and it opens windows, opens opportunities for these people, so they go to Istanbul. And it's while they're in Istanbul that they begin publishing this journal called Turkic Homeland, Turkey Urdu. And that begins in 1912. And it's really because of what they do from 1912 onwards, writing in this journal that's devoted towards discussing Turkic culture and history and traditions and ethnography and languages. It's for that reason that these figures are known in the historiography as Pan-Turkists, as early Turkish nationalists. And this is something that is embraced in Turkey as well, because for various reasons, historians in over the generations in Turkey have looked to find evidence of Turkish nationalism that preceded the creation of the Turkish Republic in 1923. So to prove, as it were, that the Turkish Republic was somehow created in response to demand, rather than a case of first creating the Turkish Republic, then creating ideas about nationalism, which is what actually happened. The preference is to try and find as many examples of Turkish nationalism as you can before the country was created. And for various reasons, this makes a lot of people feel a lot more comfortable about the story.
Right.
And so that's why these individuals, people like Gisbrisky, who was writing about, Turkish identity and the Turkish language, in 1905, 1906, for example, as well as folks like Aktra and Ağoğlu and Hüseyinzade Ali. That's why for decades they always had something of an outsized role in the historiography. People were paying probably a lot more attention to their ideas and arguments than they otherwise would, because it seemed to indicate that, yes, there was some sort of groundswell of Turkish identity, years before the creation of the Turkish Republic. However, as I mentioned, in more recent decades, people said, yeah, but who cares? These are journals that relatively few people read. These were relatively remote intellectuals who were isolated from the very communities in whose names they spoke. What I tried to do with my book was say, well, actually, yes, it's true, not very many people were reading these journals and newspapers, and yes, it's true, the Pan-Turkists were relatively remote and elite intellectuals who in many ways did not have a lot in common with other people, other Muslims in Russia or other Ottoman subjects. However, maybe by looking less at not so strictly at just their ideas and their arguments and the debates that appear in the periodical press and newspapers and journals, and maybe if we just look more at their lives and their careers, then we begin to see that they actually have a lot more in common with much bigger developments that were taking place both in Russia and in the Ottoman Empire, and among populations such as the Pan-Turkists themselves that were traveling between these empires. So, as I mentioned earlier, one way in this which took place had to do with their attitudes towards mobility and moving back and forth. And, if things don't work out for you in the Ottoman Empire, then you can go back to Russia. And if that doesn't work, then, well, maybe the political climate in Turkey will change and you can go back. Another way had to do with respect to their involvement in 1905 in Russia and the sorts of things they did, and also the way in which 1908 changed their lives. And then thirdly, as I mentioned earlier, it had to do with their approach to identity, which is important not only because they were talking about Turkish nationalism, but it's also important because their obsession with identity and exploring the different types of communities that they were a part of, that behavior by the Pan-Turkists is also representative of much broader concerns and obsessions involving not only intellectuals, scribbling, but also government officials in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and populations more generally, who were concerned maybe not so much with Turkish nationalism particularly, but for whom the question of how to organize society and how to manage difference was becoming increasingly important.
All right. Yeah, that's Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's about where your book ends too. Although we do go into a bit of an epilogue, and I sort of want to talk a little bit about that right here. And then, of course, the most important question of history: how can we apply that to today?
Sure. Thanks. So yeah, the book, the story in the book ends with the beginning of World War I in 1914, but there is an epilogue, and what I write about in the epilogue is mainly what in some ways might seem paradoxical to some people, in that I look a little bit at the post-World War I lives of Atra, Aolu, and Ali Hussein-Zadeh. They all live into the 1930s, and I note that while these individuals have generally been treated in the scholarship as the precursors to this future Turkish nation, as the people who had somehow identified this and seen in advance where history was headed, these proto-Turkish nationalists. Interestingly enough, once the Turkish nation state was actually created, their usefulness, the very skills and qualities that had helped them to succeed during the late imperial era, these very same skills and qualities caused them to be seen with suspicion by Turkish authorities after the creation of the Turkish Republic in 1923. So there's mostly the cosmopolitanism of these individuals, the fact that they were from Russia, knew Russia, had lived outside Turkey. These were all traits that had brought the Pan-Turkists opportunities in both Russia and the Ottoman Empire in earlier years. But now in the post-imperial era, these were actually aspects that caused them trouble. And they all go on to professional lives in Turkey in the 20s and 30s. Ahmet Aolu is even elected to the Turkish parliament. But slowly, and especially in the 1930s, they become a lot less influential, and their writing, which, publication in the early years, the Turkish Republic was largely controlled by the government. Their writing is largely curtailed, and their public lives come to an end. And that doesn't strike me actually as surprising at all, because what had made their moment possible, their moment of greatest fame in the years immediately preceding World War I, was the fact that they had traveled a lot in their lives, they lived in numerous cities, and they had managed to parlay these experiences into new opportunities wherever they went. By the 1930s, the fact that the Turkish government was trying to get on better relations with the Soviet Union, and that these individuals were seen by Soviet authorities, even when they were living in Turkey, these individuals were seen by Soviet authorities as anti-Soviet. That really kind of forced the hand of the Turkish government in certain ways to kind of give these individuals less of a voice while they were in Turkey. So, the very traits that it kind of brought them success in the late imperial era were actually elements that created trouble for them in the post-imperial era. But in my next project, kind of what I'm interested in is exploring this more further and kind of taking it as the beginning of my story, where I leave off in the epilogue here. You also asked a question about what this means for what's going on today, and how we can connect these events to today. Well, an argument that I make in the introduction mentioned in the book, and which I get back to in the book's conclusion, is that the late imperial era actually, in some ways, has some pretty important traits in common with the era that we're living in today, the post-Cold War era. We're living currently in a time of globalization. We're living also during a time right now where we see waves of revolutions. I mean, the post-Cold War era was initiated, first of all, by a wave of revolutions taking place in Eastern Europe in 1989. I mean, that's what brought about the post-Cold War era in the first place. The Arab Spring revolutions in the Middle East earlier this century, also the so-called color revolutions taking place in various parts of the former Soviet Union earlier this century. We live in a time when it is more possible for revolutions to seemingly jump across borders, which is something that was not really the case during the Cold War, when you think about it. Given the way the Cold War was set up, with the United States and the Soviet Union, one or both of those countries would have usually stepped in to prevent, one revolution from turning into many. We're also living today during a time of heightened politicization of identity. Certainly in the first decade after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, the wars in ex-Yugoslavia were constituted a time where national identity was invoked, as well as religious identity was invoked by many as a means of justifying war and conflict. Certainly that's also the case today, even more so perhaps with respect to religious identity in the parts of the world that I work on, especially in Russia and the Middle East.
I mean, we have Daesh right now.
Yeah, definitely. So, the fundamental argument that my book is making is that when you go beyond the slogans and go beyond the rhetoric, go beyond the discourses of national or religious identity, and you get your fingers dirty actually looking at the evidence, you see that there's actually a lot more at stake here than just this kind of airy concept of identity. That behind invocations of religious or national identity, there are usually much more tangible and material issues at stake relating to power, relating to money, relating to natural resources, relating to people's careers, people's livelihoods. And so by taking three individuals, Aktra, Kaspersky, and Aolu, who are known almost traditionally, have been known almost exclusively for their connection to identity, and showing that even these three icons of identity, once you actually look not just at their writings on identity, but also at their lives, also at their careers, and you situate their lives and careers within broader developments that are occurring at the time, you see that even these icons of identity, behind the invocations of identity, that there's a lot going on there with respect to the pursuit of tangible material objectives and goals. And so that since these individuals were not working in a vacuum, since they were representative of broader developments that were taking place at the time, I think that their story is one that is salubrious for our own time, when I think there is very much of a tendency to take people's invocations of identity at face value and say, well, Daesh calls itself the Islamic State, so that must be what an Islamic Islamic State looks like. Or, Slobodan Milosevic in the 1990s was saying, well, he's doing this in the name of, Serbian nationalism, so that must be what he wants and nothing else. Well, once you get beyond that discourse, once you get beyond that sort of posturing, you see that these conflicts have nothing to do with religion, or some sort of national ideology that somehow works on its own. No, these are justifications that people come up with, usually to mask other, often quite more base ambitions that tend to be related to money and power, and that we need to look at those. And so I thought that by telling the story of nationalist icons and looking at how there is a lot more than just national identity going on in their stories, and that this is also true of their time more generally, that perhaps this will also lead some people to question some of the stories that we think are true today with respect to the importance of national and religious identity, which I argue are, to a large extent, smokescreens to hide what is actually really motivating people most who invoke these identity forms.
I think that's a really important lesson, especially in today's political climate. But now for a bit of levity after that really deep moment. It's time for the off-topic question of the day.
Yes.
Who would win in a fight between Putin and Stalin, assuming they don't have any bodyguards with them?
That's easy. Putin. Stalin's dead. Putin's still alive and kicking, and I think he'd easily win that fight. No question at all.
I agree. Even if Stalin was living, I think Putin would still be able to put him down. KGB training is nothing to mess with.
It's true, and Stalin was very short. He was, I think he was about 5'2". I'm not quite sure how tall Putin is, but he's definitely taller than 5'2". Stalin was kind of a little guy, but who nevertheless, I guess, managed to find a way to push people around. Yeah, look out for the little people.
Yeah. All right, so it's time for the book recommendation of the day. Considering the topic of today's episode, I think you know what it might be. Turks Across Empires, Meyer's book that we've been talking about this entire time. It's a well-written, in-depth look into today's topic, and it's not really a long read either. If you found this episode interesting at all, check it out. I want to thank Dr. James Meyer. I want to thank my dad for helping me put together the logo. And I want to thank everyone else who helped me along the way. You know who you are.
And I also want to thank your dad for sending his son to Montana State University.
Well,
wise choice.
I'm sure he's glad too. It's a lot cheaper.
Yes.
So don't forget to stay after the show for some important information. But for now, I leave you on Mozart Symphony No. 40 in G minor. Hey, thanks for staying after the show. Sorry about the recording quality for the show. I realized after the fact that the recording volume was much too high, but I've got it fixed right now. I suppose you're wondering how this show is going to work. I'm planning on having an episode every 2 months. I realize that's a very long time, and I apologize for that. But this thing has been so hard to set up. I think I need the time in between, especially with my college career still looming around the horizon. As for other information, what qualifies me, I'm a history major, so not exactly qualified yet, but I definitely have an interest in it. So hopefully you can bear with me as I do this show. You may have noticed I'm not reading off a script here. I didn't think this needed to be scripted, but I'm seeing that I might have needed to. And that's another thing. This is not going to be a scripted show. Rarely ever will there be anything that is scripted. So don't plan on things sounding perfect. I also try not to cut anything out of these shows, and most of these shows will stay in the 1 hour range. So hopefully I won't have to cut anything out, because then it won't be in the hour range. This one's obviously a little short. It's actually in the 50-minute range minus what I'm doing right now. If you like the show, please consider donating to the Patreon that I have. If you want my recording quality to go up, there's a Patreon reward for that. It's one of the goals, not a reward, but a goal. If you want audio reversions of these episodes, pay $1 on the Patreon, and you'll get the digital file for that. You can put it on your iPod and listen to it on the go. As far as other Patreon things, I'm also putting up a goal where if I start getting a certain amount per month, I will, if I get that much, I'll make a new show, which will come out probably every week. I think I can manage that, because it won't be as much about history. It'll be a general show. Let's see. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, on Tumblr, obviously on YouTube, and I have a Gmail account. All of those are under History Roundtable Podcast. So if you just type in History Roundtable Podcast, so the Gmail specifically is historyroundtablepodcast@gmail.com, then you'll find me. I don't know if you want to find me, but you will. As you probably heard at the beginning of the show, this is not just a show for historians. I'm also going to have people who aren't historians. In fact, my next show is going to have my dad on, who is not a historian, but is an author of books about comic book writers and comic book history. So we're going to have him on and talk comic book history. And I actually honestly don't know what other non-historians will have on the show. That's really something that's going to be discovered at a later date. As for anything else, if you have any questions, please email me at my email, historyroundtablepodcast@gmail.com, or put a comment here on the YouTube page, or put a comment on the Facebook page, or hit me up on Twitter or Tumblr or whatever. Whatever. Anyways, I think it's time for me to stop wasting your time. Again, any other questions, just ask. Thanks. One more thing I remembered after I hit end. If you want a link to find Turks across